Today I want to show you one of my favourite finishes for a fully lined bodice, especially with a semi-sheer fabric like the Georgette that I used for the Vogue 9265. I like to bag out the armholes, as you can see here, by machine. There are other methods. You can do this by hand. You could also French seam this armhole seam. You can use bias binding to finish off the seam. There are lots of different methods, and depending on the type of fabric you're using will determine what kind of method will work best for you. This is one of my favorites, and I'm going to show you the trick that I use to do any kind of bagging out, whether it's for an armhole lining like this, or the sleeve lining at the bottom of a cuff, or for finishing a centre back seam with a zipper. This trick will work for all of those methods, but we're going to have a look at the armhole today. As you can see here, the pattern would have you baste the armhole lining to the outer fabric and then treat this piece as one for the later step of sewing in the sleeve. This step says, with right sides together, pin sleeve into armhole, placing large circle at shoulder seam. Adjust the ease and baste. Stitch and stitch again 1/4 inch 6mm away in seam allowance. Trim close to stitching, press seam allowance flat, turn seam allowance towards sleeves. This doesn't give you any kind of finish on that raw edge that they're asking you to leave within the armhole, which is why I like to use one of the methods that I just mentioned. And today I'm going to be showing you how to bag out this seam so that you end up with a nice clean finish on the inside of your garment. I've still got my sleeve linings flapping free, so I want to finish those off nicely. I am going to, with the wrong sides together, what I want to do is turn under the seam allowance at for example, the side seam, just so that you've got a reference point. We're going to turn that under by about 5/8 of an inch, and you want to pin it to the seam line that we have just stitched into place. And you kind of want to match things up, but you don't need to be too careful about it at this stage, because we're just pinning things into place so that we can then reach through and pull things through so that we can bag it out without creating a Mobius loop. And this is my trick for bagging out anything. You want to pin it into the place that you want it to be when it's finished before you start pinning it right sides together to actually sew the seam, because if we pull this through, so I've literally just folded back the lining, this is where the pin is, you will end up having to sew around in a kind of loop here. So once you've reached through and grabbed that place that you've pinned, you want to hang on to the place you've pinned, and you're going to remove the pin but not your hand, so you're still holding on to everything. Then you're going to replace the pin so that the right sides are together, and this time you want to be really careful about matching up your seam allowances. And we're going to be sewing with the line of stitching that we've just done on top, because you want to be sewing over that line of stitching for a second time. So I've literally just moved the pin from the other side, and I've got the underarm or the side seam matching up with the side seam of the lining, and the sleeve is in between those two pieces. So we're going to go around and we are going to pin our sleeve into place the whole way around. So you match up your double notches, your single notch, your shoulder seam. It will get a little bit tight because you will have to sew that, you know, there is going to be part of the bodice in the way, but it is completely doable. So match up our princess seams, and I'm only matching up like, you know, big match points like princess seams and that at the moment, because we're going to refine things in a second. Going around the other way this time, I'm going to match up my single notch. And again, we're doing it with the seam that we've just sewn, so the outer fabric on top, so that you can see that line of stitching, because we're going to be stitching on top of it. The other shoulder seams, it's going to get a little bit tight, so we're going to just pull carefully. And again, you want to make sure that you're not catching anything in this line of, or pinning at the moment, that we do not want to get caught. So I've basically pinned from princess seam to princess seam. I am going to keep pulling this through very carefully. It is going to be tight. This is doable, but it is tight. You maybe want to try and do this in 2 passes, which is also totally possible, and probably what I'm going to do actually, because this is quite tight. The shoulder seams on this dress are quite small. Because you've got the original initial pins in place, you can't really get this wrong when you're pulling things through. And just make sure that you're not catching any of the fullness of the sleeve in this pinning. If you don't want to do this because you're worried you're going to catch things or like pin the wrong thing into place, you can totally hand stitch the lining into place around the armhole. That is a very valid option. The other option as well, if you don't want to bag out your lining, is you can French seam your sleeve in, and I have got a full tutorial on how to do that, and I will list that in the description as well. So just pinning the shoulder seam into place now. So I'm going to sew from the underarm seam to the shoulder seam, and then I'm going to redistribute everything so that I can sew the other side from the shoulder seam to the underarm seam. If it gets too bulky or it isn't behaving itself, backstitch, take the work out from under the machine and rearrange everything, pull things through, and then start stitching again, because it won't matter as long as you don't like go into the body of the garment. It won't matter if you backstitch, and we are stitching over 5/8 of an inch over that line of stitching that we have just done. Okay, so that definitely was awkward. There was one way that was easier. So pulling the garment through to the back made sewing up to the shoulder seam much easier than trying to pull it all the way through the front. We do have something else to do before we can call this finished, but I am going to pull everything through and just make sure that I haven't caught anything like the sleeve anywhere I don't want it to, or the lining anywhere I don't want it to, and I haven't. But you can see it's really tight and puckering, and that's not going to sit nicely if we left the garment like that. So what you want to do is reach back inside, and I would suggest that you do double check before you start doing this, because the next step is to trim off all of this excess allowance with your pinking shears. And obviously if you've caught something, like if you've caught the sleeve within the seam and you cut it with your pinking shears before you check, you can cut holes in your sleeve. Ask me how I know. So I'm going to go grab my pinking shears and I'm going to trim kind of 1/4 of an inch away from the stitching line. We've reinforced that stitching line because we've gone over it twice, so trimming away with your pinking shears will release all the tension as well and make the armhole sit really nicely. Let me grab my pinking shears, get this done. You want to be super careful when you're doing this and make sure that you don't cut anything that you don't want to, because it would be a pain in the proverbial to repair or replace the pattern piece if you do cut something that you shouldn't. So pinking shears to trim this off, and then we can do the same for the other side. Okay, so as you saw, that took a while and I needed to do 2 passes, but if I now turn this through, and obviously this has not been pressed yet, but the armhole is going to sit a lot flatter. It is all nicely finished. Okay, so I'm going to take that over to the ironing board and give that whole seam a press. That is the armhole neatly finished for the garment so that it looks pretty on the inside and the outside. Obviously I need to repeat that for this side. So the important part, again, I will stress, is pinning the seam allowance at the first instance so that you don't end up with a Mobius loop. So you want to take your underarm seam allowance here, turn it under by 5/8 of an inch and pin it to the corresponding seam on the bodice, and then you peel back the lining from the main body of the fabric. You grab the seam where you have pinned, holding onto it. You then take your pin out and repin with right sides together, matching up your seam allowances very precisely on this side. Pin it into place the whole way around, and then 5/8 of an inch over the previous line of stitching, probably in 2 or 3 passes, and then trim with your pinking shears. And as you can see, once everything is pressed, you get a nice clean finish on the inside and the outside of the garment. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section down below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. And if you've enjoyed this video, there's an entire playlist of mini tutorials going through specific one-off steps to create a gorgeous garment inside and out, and I'll link it in the description down below.